I used to believe that family, especially Southern family, meant refuge, tradition, Sunday dinners, a place where loyalty mattered more than appearances. Then, one April morning in 2023, in my parents' stately Beaufort home with its polished floors and curated grace, my mother proved me wrong. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "We are not funding this circus," she said, each syllable placed with the precision of someone accustomed to commanding rooms without lifting a finger. My sister Charlotte lifted her eyes from her phone, just long enough to offer a knowing little smile, the kind a person gives when they have been waiting to watch you fail. "Better luck next time," she whispered, like my life was a game she was winning. My father looked out toward the marsh as if the water might offer an escape from choosing a side. His silence was not confusion or mercy. It was permission. My wedding plans, months of careful preparation, a future I built piece by piece with someone I loved, were dismissed as if they were nothing more than an inconvenient social misstep. I felt a cold quiet settle inside me. A younger version of myself would have tried to explain to negotiate to earn their approval the way I had spent a lifetime doing, but 34-year-old me saw clearly. This was not concern about finances or family standards. This was control, image, the unspoken family rule. You may have dreams as long as they match ours. My mother expected panic, a tear, a frantic defense. That was how this house worked. Power through poise, influence through gentle tone and hard expectations. Instead, I looked at Charlotte, at my father, who could not meet my eyes, and I said one word. Understood. It sounded calm, simple, but inside it felt like a door unlocking. My mother blinked just once, a ripple in her perfect composure. She knew my tone. She taught it to me. Polite, controlled, final. Charlotte waited for me to crumble. My father exhaled, relieved he would not need to perform empathy. No one followed me when I left. That was how confidence looked in this family. They believed obedience was permanent. They believed I would come back apologizing for daring to choose my own life. I walked past the framed portraits on the hallway wall, the ones celebrating generations of Hayes' composure and social rank, people who understood the value of reputation above truth. I stepped out into the warm Carolina air and drove back to Charleston in silence. My phone buzzed again and again in the passenger seat. I let it ring. I needed stillness more than explanations. Stillness had always been where I gathered myself when this family demanded I fold. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands had stopped shaking, mostly. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the stack of wedding invitations on the counter, their cream paper and gold script suddenly feeling heavier than they had the night before. They represented the life I chose. Love built on honesty and kindness rather than expectation and performance. I ran my fingers along the edges, then placed them gently in a box. Not as surrender, but as pause. There is a moment when heartbreak shifts. It stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like clarity. Mine arrived in that quiet kitchen as the late afternoon sun spilled across the counter. A realization settled in slowly and without ceremony. My family did not reject my wedding. They rejected my independence. My happiness had never been the priority. My compliance had. And the strangest part was this. I did not feel shattered. I felt awake. For the first time, the silence did not feel like defeat. It felt like preparation. I picked up my phone and texted Michael. "I am coming over. We need to talk." Then I caught my own reflection in the dark screen. My face was steady, my eyes clear. Understood no longer meant I accepted their terms. It meant I was finished living by them. Have you ever discovered that the people who claimed to love you most only supported you when you lived the life they scripted for you? If you have, then you know this feeling. It is not weakness. It is the beginning of choosing yourself. And in that moment, I did not know exactly what was coming next. I only knew this. It would not be obedience. It would be truth. And for once in my life, my future would belong to me. In the South, reputation does not arrive suddenly. It is cultivated, curated, passed down like family silver, and expected to shine just as brightly. Growing up in the Hayes household meant living inside a performance disguised as tradition. Our home in Beaufort sat beneath ancient oaks laced with Spanish moss, the kind tourists photograph because it looks like history frozen in time. To outsiders, we were the picture of grace and stability. Sunday services at the White Steeple Church on Bay Street, the kind where ushers wear pressed jackets and everyone knows who sits in which pew. Charity galas at the Waterfront Club where my mother Caroline accepted compliments about her poise the way others received oxygen. Winter socials, summer garden brunches, handwritten invitations, pearls in daylight linen and heat. It was a life built on ritual and image polished until it gleamed. There was never shouting in our home. That would have been considered sloppy, common, almost vulgar. Instead, there were rules spoken softly and expectations enforced through disappointment so subtle it felt like a temperature change rather than discipline. My mother often said that Southern women do not raise their voices. We raise our standards. It sounded elegant when she said it. Beautiful, even. But as I got older, I realized it was not advice. It was a warning. We avoided conflict by refusing to acknowledge it. We did not speak of uncomfortable truths. We rearranged them until they looked presentable. A message was never delivered directly when it could be delivered through tone. A lesson was never taught through correction when it could be taught through withdrawal. My father Thomas understood this world perfectly. He had inherited it as naturally as he inherited his father's name. He was the type of man who believed a calm expression proved moral superiority, and that disapproval when executed quietly carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. If my mother was the architect of our family image, my father was the silent guardian of its walls. His stillness was not peace. It was a reminder that silence can hold more power than volume. And then there was my sister Charlotte, 3 years younger, and raised like a delicate heirloom meant for display, not use. Where I was taught responsibility, she was taught confidence. Where I was taught to earn approval, she was handed it before she asked. It was not that she tried harder to fit our family's ideal. It was that she never had to. Some children are raised to carry a legacy. Others are raised to protect one. Charlotte was polished early, guided without friction, praised without pause. I was shaped through quiet correction, redirected each time I showed an instinct that did not match our household tone. When I brought home an A, I was told excellence was expected. When Charlotte earned a B, she was praised for her effort and encouraged to try again when she felt ready. No one ever said outright that one of us mattered more. They did not need to. Southern families have a language without words. It speaks through seating arrangements at dinners, the temperature of a mother's smile, the subtle tilt of a father's head when something fails to meet standard. In our family, success was measured in composure, in the ability to maintain grace when life threatened to wrinkle the surface. Feelings were acknowledged only when they could be packaged neatly. Pride was expressed only when it did not look like boasting. Regret was never spoken aloud. We simply moved forward as if the past had already behaved. Disappointment arrived gently, like a cool breeze through a window left slightly open. You felt it before you understood it, and by the time you realized it was shaping you, you had already changed to match its demands. When I was young, I believed this meant we were special, that our quiet restraint set us apart from families who argued or cried or admitted faults. I thought silence meant strength and composure meant love. Now I know silence can also mean control, and composure can be the prettiest disguise for pressure. Looking back, I can see how every expectation was a thread woven into a tapestry I did not choose but was expected to hang inside of. The church pews, the charity events, the family name spoken with pride at luncheons. The gentle reminders that we do not embarrass ourselves and certainly do not embarrass each other. Everything in our world was designed to protect an image first and the individuals inside it second. And in a place where appearance is everything, independence is often treated as betrayal. My mother once told me that dignity means never letting emotion show. At the time, I believed her. For years, I believed her. But as I sat in my Charleston apartment after she canceled my wedding, surrounded by a life I had built with my own decisions and my own values, I wondered if dignity might also mean refusing to dim your life to keep someone else comfortable. In my family, love was always conditional, offered generously only when you lived according to the standards set long before you were born. Tradition was treasured, obedience praised, individuality tolerated only when it did not disturb the family silhouette. I did not recognize it fully then, but the seeds of my rebellion did not begin the day my mother ended my wedding. They began in the quiet corners of that southern house, where silence ruled, where emotion was smoothed away before it could wrinkle the portrait, where loyalty meant staying small enough to fit inside someone else's expectations. Back then, I thought the world outside our gates would judge us if we failed to maintain perfection. Now, I understand the truth. The judgment was always inside, and it was us doing the judging. I remember being 8 years old and convinced that color could change a life. I would sit on the floor of my room with fabric scraps I collected from thrift stores and draw dresses in the margins of my homework. While other children were memorizing state capitals, I was sketching silhouettes and draping ribbon over dolls like they were models preparing for a runway that only existed in my imagination. It felt natural, joyful, a language that did not require permission. For a long time, it never occurred to me that creativity could be considered disobedience. I learned the truth one quiet afternoon. I had left my sketchbook open on my bed, pages filled with gowns made from lace motifs and silk folds I had studied in magazines I secretly borrowed from the library. When I came home from school, the sketchbook was gone. I looked everywhere under pillows and drawers behind my desk. I finally found it in the kitchen trash, folded once not torn, just dismissed. My mother was arranging flowers in a porcelain vase, perfectly calm as always. I asked where my notebook was, my voice small but steady. She did not look up. Practical careers only, darling. A life needs stability. It was not anger. It was not scolding. It was something colder, a decision already made for me. The conversation ended before I could speak. In our home, feelings were not arguments. They were accidents to be cleaned up quickly. That was the day I first felt a quiet sting I did not yet know how to name. The sting of being guided away from myself. My sister Charlotte was watching from the doorway, her hair tied with a satin bow, holding a trophy from her ballet class. She showed it to our mother, and the whole room warmed. There were soft praises, gentle touches on her shoulder, pride wrapped in sweetness. No one asked me what I achieved that day. No one noticed the empty space in my hands. That is how lessons were taught in our family. Not through reprimand, but through contrast. Charlotte glowed and was celebrated. I tried something new, and it disappeared. I learned quickly that certain interests earned applause while others earned silence. When I brought home a drawing from art class, it was placed neatly on the counter and never mentioned again. When Charlotte baked scones with my mother from a family recipe book, the kitchen filled with approval. When I asked to take sewing lessons, I was told it was charming, but perhaps a more serious extracurricular would serve me better. Debate team business club, French tutoring, something respectable, something strategic. No one shouted, no one punished, they simply directed, praised in the right places, ignored in others. Encouragement flowed like water toward the path they had chosen for us, long before we could choose for ourselves. And I, wanting to belong the way children do, followed the current. I traded fabric for spreadsheets, pencils for calculators. I learned that neat handwriting impressed teachers and that straight A's impressed my parents, but only Charlotte made them beam. I convinced myself that admiration could be earned if I just chose better accomplishments. I did not realize then that I was trying to win a game whose rules changed depending on the player. Charlotte could falter and she would be lifted. I could excel quietly, and it would be treated as expected. I think that is how children become obedient adults, not through force, but through subtle shaping. A tilt of the head, a soft sigh, a glance exchanged between parents that says everything without a word spoken, a raised eyebrow when you speak out of turn, a smile withheld when you offer something of yourself. These moments do not feel like discipline. They feel like gravity. You grow around them until your shape matches the house you were raised in. When I entered high school, I knew how to read a room like a social map. I knew what clothes earned approval, what tone impressed elders, what subjects elicited nods of approval. I could host a conversation about legacy and philanthropy by 14, but I could not tell anyone how I felt without rehearsing the sentence twice. Feelings were fragile and therefore private. Achievement was currency and therefore public. I learned that applause was conditional, affection was measured, and silence was a ceiling you learned not to push against. Yet even with all that training, the spark never fully left. Late at night, I sketched quietly under the covers with a flashlight. designs tucked between textbook pages, swatches hidden in desk drawers, a secret rebellion small but alive. Sometimes I would imagine a life where creativity was not considered frivolous, where ambition did not have to look like power to be respected, where I did not need permission to be seen, but in our home dreams were not crushed loudly. They were guided into acceptable shapes. A gentle redirection here, a subtle dismissal there until the path you walk feels like a choice even when it was handed to you. I used to think that was love, structured, protective, intentional. Now I understand it was something else. Not cruelty, but containment. Not punishment, but molding. A beautiful cage does not feel like captivity until you see the door. And I would not see mine fully until the morning my mother canceled my wedding. But the truth is, the foundation of that moment was built long before. In the quiet corners where little girls decide which parts of themselves are allowed to stay. I met Michael Carter on a warm evening in Savannah, the kind where the air feels like silk and strangers speak to one another as if they have known each other for years. It was a community fundraiser at the historic Lucas Theater downtown. I was there because my firm sponsored a table and attendance was more of an obligation than a choice. He was there because one of the youth programs he volunteered with was receiving recognition. I remember walking into the lobby, the chandeliers glowing jazz humming softly, and seeing him helping an elderly woman find her seat with a patience that felt almost unreal in a world that often celebrates urgency more than kindness. He did not know who I was. He did not notice who I was with. He simply offered warmth, genuine and uncomplicated, the kind that does not check credentials before extending itself. We ended up seated near each other at dinner. He asked questions that were not rehearsed or strategic. He wanted to know what made me happy, what I dreamed of as a child, what I did when I had time to myself. In my world, conversations often felt like negotiations for approval. With him, it felt like being invited instead of evaluated. I remember laughing a real laugh, not the polite one I had been trained to offer. It surprised even me. When the fundraiser ended, we walked outside onto Broughton Street under glowing street lamps. He asked if he could see me again. I said yes before I had time to calculate how it would sound, and that spontaneity felt like stepping into sunlight after standing in shade for too long. Our first official date was at a small coffee shop tucked off Chippewa Square. He arrived early, sat with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, reading a book on public service leadership. Not because it made him look impressive, but because he genuinely cared about the work. He listened when I spoke, and he remembered. When he asked about my job, it did not feel like small talk. He was curious, not impressed or intimidated. Most people saw my career and family background before they saw me. He saw me first. The more I learned about him, the more I noticed the contrast between his world and mine. His family was warm and casual, full of imperfections they did not hide and laughter they did not restrain. His parents teased each other lovingly over dinner. They hugged without hesitation. They asked real questions without tiptoeing around the answers. The first time I visited his family in Richmond Hill, his mother handed me a plate of homemade peach cobbler and asked what I loved doing more than anything in the world. No one had asked me that in years. I almost forgot how to answer. We were together for almost 3 years before the proposal. He planned it quietly, without grand performance, without flash or the expectation of an audience. It was early spring in Forsyth Park in Savannah. The azaleas were blooming, painting the park in every shade of pink and purple. We walked under the moss-draped trees, the fountain sparkling in the morning light. He paused near a bench, pulled a small box from his pocket, and looked at me with the steadiness of someone who understood that commitment was more than ceremony. It was choosing someone every day, not just one day. I felt seen, truly seen. Not as a daughter in a prominent family or an accountant with a polished resume, but as a person with hopes and fears and dreams I had tucked away so quietly I almost forgot they were there. When he asked me to marry him, my yes was immediate and certain. Not because it was expected or strategic, but because his presence felt like possibility rather than command. We celebrated with coffee at a small cafe instead of champagne at a country club. I texted my parents a picture of the ring. My mother replied first, "Lovely." Then after a long pause, "He seems very kind, at least." It was a compliment shaped like caution. Kindness was admirable, but in her world it was not currency. Stability was measured in status, charm was a tool, and careers carried weight like family names. My father called later, offering congratulations in a tone that sounded practiced. He asked what Michael did for a living. When I told him Michael worked in nonprofit youth services, there was a beat of silence. "That must be rewarding work," he said, his voice neutral, polite. I knew that tone. I grew up with that tone. It meant acceptable enough not to question publicly, concerning enough to evaluate privately. Charlotte did not call. She sent a text. Cute ring. I learned a long time ago that in my family subtlety could bruise more deeply than confrontation. But something had shifted in me. Their restrained reception did not dull my joy. I held Michael's hand, looked at the life we were planning, and realized I did not need their approval to feel worthy. Love, real love, had a different language. We began planning the wedding quietly at first, savoring the simplicity. Weekends in Charleston, walks along the Battery, conversations about future mornings and shared routines. Not extravagant dreams, but sincere ones. At night, while he read beside me, I sometimes pulled out an old notebook and sketched dresses for the first time in years. Not to show anyone, just because it reminded me of who I once was. In those moments, I felt hope untangle itself from old expectations and stretch out like it had been waiting patiently for space. I did not know then that choosing happiness would be seen as disobedience. I did not know joy could be perceived as betrayal by those who measure love through control. I only knew that with Michael, peace did not require perfection. And maybe that was the most dangerous thing of all, because once you learn what genuine acceptance feels like, you cannot unlearn it. You cannot unsee your own worth. And if you have spent your life shrinking to fit someone else's comfort, the moment you stop shrinking does not look like growth to them. It looks like rebellion. At the time, I simply felt grateful. I believed love could coexist with family duty. I thought I could carry tradition in one hand and autonomy in the other. I did not yet understand that some families only applaud achievements when they are accomplishments they chose for you. And choosing for yourself, even in love, can be seen as an unforgivable act of independence. If you have ever found someone who brings out the parts of you the world made you bury, then you know how powerful hope can be, and how threatening it becomes to those who mistook your compliance for loyalty. Planning our wedding felt at first like breathing in fresh air after years of holding my breath. Michael and I toured venues where oak branches swept low and sunlight filtered through Spanish moss like blessings. We fell in love with Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. It was elegant but not extravagant, steeped in history, yet peaceful with winding paths along the river and white bridges arching over water lilies. I imagined vows spoken beneath a canopy of ancient trees, soft music, simple flowers, the kind of ceremony built on sincerity rather than spectacle. Michael squeezed my hand that day and said, "This feels like us." And it did. Quiet, graceful, honest. When we told my parents, I saw the pause before my mother smiled. A small, composed nod. Nice, though perhaps a bit rustic. Rustic. In her vocabulary, that meant charming for photographs but not aligned with social expectations. She suggested we look at a private club in Charleston known for its marble floors and long wait list. It is important that a wedding reflects legacy, Eleanor. People remember these moments. I knew she meant her moments, her guests, her circle. Still, I held my ground gently. "We chose Magnolia because it reflects who we are," I said. She pursed her lips in the polite way she did when she believed she was being reasonable and I was simply inexperienced. "Family tradition should guide big decisions, darling. Our name carries expectations." There it was, tradition. Expectation. Words wrapped in silk yet heavy as stone. My father, sitting beside her, offered one supportive hum, then returned to reading the business section of the newspaper. That was his role. Presence without intervention. Approval through silence. Disapproval the same way. The shift came gradually, disguised as interest. My mother offered to help with planning. Not to control, of course, simply to assist. She asked for the guest list to coordinate social connections. Within a week, she had added 30 names from her garden club, 10 from the church board, and a handful from a philanthropic committee she chaired. My wedding was becoming a networking event. When I hesitated, she placed her hand over mine gently and said, "These people have supported our family for years. It would be unkind to exclude them. Unkind. A powerful word in her world. Exclusion, even in normal circumstances, was considered a breach of etiquette. Refusing might appear ungrateful. Appearances mattered more than comfort, more than authenticity. Michael noticed the tension. "We will keep it small," he whispered one evening, placing his hand on my shoulder as we reviewed the ever-growing guest list. "We are allowed to have boundaries." I nodded, but a familiar tightening in my chest returned the feeling of being pulled back into a pattern I spent years learning and even longer trying to unlearn. It is hard to set boundaries in a family where boundaries are interpreted as disrespect. My mother began offering decisions disguised as suggestions. What if we upgrade the catering A-plated dinner is more in line with our circle? Do consider a string quartet. A band might feel casual. Monogrammed invitations would elevate the tone. Her comments were wrapped in praise. "You have such lovely taste, Eleanor, but a wedding of this significance deserves proper refinement." I wanted to believe she was trying to help, but every suggestion nudged us toward a version of celebration that felt less and less like ours and more like hers. Charlotte predictably sided with my mother. When we tried on dresses, I chose a simple silk gown elegant in its quiet beauty. Charlotte sighed as if burdened by diplomacy. "It is lovely, just understated. People might expect something more memorable." Memorable. A word that sounded like advice but carried judgment. My mother nodded in agreement. Timeless simplicity is admirable, but we would not want it to appear plain. That was the thing about emotional control. It rarely sounded harsh. It sounded like guidance. It sounded like concern. It sounded like love coded in etiquette. And so I found myself torn between honoring my own vision and appeasing a hierarchy I had been raised to maintain. I tried small compromises, a different floral arrangement, a slightly more elaborate cake, but each concession opened the door to another one. Expectations expanded like fabric stretching until the seams strained. One evening, after another planning discussion that felt more like a chess match than a celebration, I sat at the table holding the seating chart. My mother circled names as if making selections for a gala rather than her daughter's wedding. "If it does not reflect our family standards, it is not a celebration," she said. The sentence was smooth, polished, spoken like a time-honored truth. Family standards, legacy, image. Those words carried a force I had been trained to bow to. Michael looked at me across the table, his eyes steady. "Are you happy with this?" The question felt too big. Happiness. It had become secondary to strategy. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that love and tradition could share the same space. But in that moment, I felt a flicker of something honest and uncomfortable. Doubt. We left my parents' house in silence that night, the drive back to Charleston shadowed by unspoken questions. The wedding plans felt heavier, not because of details, but because of the subtle pressure to perform a version of myself that was acceptable to the world I came from. A version who knew how to comply gracefully. A version who did not question who the celebration was really for. Love felt clear. Family felt complicated. And I began to understand that choosing one might require redefining the other. If you ever planned something joyful only to watch it slowly shift into someone else's vision, you know this feeling. It is not a sudden break. It is a quiet erosion, one suggestion at a time, one polite correction at a time, until the life meant to be yours starts to look suspiciously like a reflection of someone else's expectations. I still believed then that I could balance both worlds, that tradition and independence could coexist. I had not yet learned that in some families, tradition means obedience and independence looks like defiance no matter how politely it arrives. I did not expect an ambush. I thought it would be another planning conversation, another afternoon of balancing my vision with my family's relentless expectations. My mother invited us to the Beaufort house on a bright Friday in early March. The air smelled of jasmine and salt, and sunlight glittered across the creek behind the property. It should have been a lovely day. It was not. The moment we arrived, I felt that familiar shift in atmosphere, the subtle tightening, the quiet anticipation of judgment, dressed as concern. The living room was staged perfectly arrangements of fresh hydrangeas, crystal glasses filled with iced tea, silver coasters placed with precision. Everything in that house was curated, even the confrontations. My mother sat straight-backed in her favorite armchair, pearls resting perfectly at her collarbone. Charlotte lounged nearby, pretending to scroll through her phone, but clearly waiting, enjoying the suspense. My father stood by the windows, hands in his pockets, posture calm, as if nothing in the world could disturb his stillness. That was how he survived in this house. He let silence do the work. My mother began gently. "Eleanor, we have been thinking." It was never good when she spoke in plural. It meant decisions had already been made behind closed doors where my voice was not invited. "Your wedding is important," she continued, "and we want it to reflect the dignity and history of our family." I nodded, polite. I had heard this line before, many times. And perhaps she added in a tone soft enough to sound caring. We moved too quickly, offering to assist financially. Michael shifted slightly beside me. I could feel the tension in his hand as he held mine. My mother folded her hands neatly in her lap. After careful consideration, she said, choosing each word like it had weight in a contract, "We will no longer contribute." There it was, delivered without drama. No raised voice, no accusation, but precise and final, the kind of sentence that closes doors and locks them. My stomach dipped, but my face stayed still. Years of training rising like muscle memory. I did not respond immediately because silence is a currency in families like ours. You spend it wisely. Charlotte raised her head, then unable to contain her satisfaction. "We simply cannot fund a modest event," she added, her tone wrapped in sweetness but sharpened enough to cut. Modest, a polite insult. A reminder that in our world sincerity was admirable only if it glittered. My father did not look at me. He watched the water outside as though conflict did not concern him, as though neutrality was nobility. But neutrality in a moment of power is not neutrality at all. It is alignment with whoever holds control. And in our home, that was always my mother. I think Michael expected outrage, a plea, at least a visible reaction. He squeezed my hand gently, ready to support me. Instead, I felt the same stillness that rushed through me the day my mother first dismissed my wedding dreams. A pause, not of shock, but of realization. This was not about money. It never had been. It was about obedience. About making sure I remembered who was allowed to decide the tone of my life. About reclaiming authority over a path I had dared to choose independently. My mother waited, confident I would bend. I always had before. But something inside me shifted like a door quietly closing on an old room I no longer wished to stand in. I looked at her, then at my father, then briefly at Charlotte, who looked almost disappointed that I had not broken yet. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. My voice was steady, my tone measured. If power in our family came through poise, I would wield it too. My mother blinked once. It was the smallest crack in her composure, but I saw it. She expected desperation. Instead, she received dignity. "You should understand," she continued, trying to regain ground. "This is simply not the kind of wedding people expect from our family. Our family." That phrase, so heavy with implied ownership. My life was not a representative project. My marriage was not a performance for her peers. I held her gaze. "I understand perfectly." The words were gentle, but they did not bend. For a moment, there was a silence that felt like a held breath, like the moment before a storm realizes it has no power over the ground beneath it. My mother's expression cooled. Dignity, not anger. But I knew that look. She was recalculating, reassessing the shape of my obedience. Charlotte glanced between us, her satisfaction flickering into uncertainty. My father cleared his throat as if to speak, then decided against it. Silence again, as shield. I stood slowly. Michael rose with me, steady and warm, a quiet counterpoint to the cold room. "Thank you for your time," I said softly. "We will see ourselves out." My mother's brows lifted just slightly, not enough to be rude, but enough to signal her confusion. I was not behaving according to script. I walked toward the door without rushing, without trembling. Every step felt like shedding a layer I had worn for decades. As we reached the front foyer, my mother spoke once more, her voice still elegant but sharper now. "Eleanor, do not be impulsive." This is not personal. That sentence hung in the air like perfume. Not personal. The ending of my wedding. The withdrawal of support meant to control its shape. The subtle humiliation disguised as etiquette. Not personal. I turned back just enough to meet her eyes. Everything about this is personal. Then I opened the door and stepped into the sunlight. The air outside tasted different, fresher somehow. Freedom often arrives not in bursts, but in quiet resolve. Michael exhaled once we reached the car. "I am proud of you," he said softly. I nodded, though my heart felt heavy, not triumphant. Setting a boundary in a family that worships control does not feel like liberation at first. It feels like loss. But there is a moment when dignity stands taller than fear. I had reached it. And though none of us said it aloud, something fundamental shifted in that living room. My mother thought she had asserted control. She did not realize she had released me. If you have ever walked out of a room and understood in your bones that you would never return to it the same person, then you know that silence can be the beginning of a story, not the end. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew one truth with startling clarity. They believed they had drawn the boundary, but the boundary was mine. The first morning after the ambush, I woke before sunrise without an alarm. It was not restlessness exactly. More like my mind had stepped into a new room and did not yet know how to rest inside it. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like a blank page instead of emptiness. I laced my shoes and walked out into the Charleston dawn. The air smelled of river salt and magnolia, and the sky was just beginning to wash itself in pale light. I walked along the Battery past iron gates and pastel houses, past joggers and early risers, watering potted plants on balconies. Step by step, the previous day replayed itself. My mother's poised dismissal, Charlotte's pleased smirk, my father's practiced stillness, and then my own voice calm and clear in my head again. "Thank you for letting me know." It surprised me how much peace came from that sentence. Not power, not triumph. Peace. When I returned home, I made coffee, slowly paying attention to each movement. I opened windows. I aired out rooms. I folded blankets, rearranged the flowers on my kitchen island. It was not about perfection. It was about reclaiming my space from the lingering echo of their control. For the first time in years, I turned my phone off. Not silence from others, but silence chosen by me. I opened closets and drawers, sorting through clothes I had bought because they pleased someone else because they matched expectations. I placed them in neat stacks near the door to donate later. I kept the clothes that felt like me even if they never impressed anyone at Sunday luncheons in Beaufort. By afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the old storage trunk in my bedroom, the one I had carried through college and my early adulthood. Inside, tucked under winter scarves and forgotten notebooks, was my high school sketchbook. The corners were frayed. The pages curled slightly with age. I sat on the floor and opened it. Pencil dresses filled the pages, hems sweeping collars high, sleeves dramatic in ways I never dared wear. I traced the lines with my fingertips. My younger self had not drawn like someone seeking approval. She drew like someone building possibility. I missed her. A wave of regret rolled through me and settled without bitterness. It was not too late. It had simply taken time to hear my own voice again beneath the quiet demands of a legacy I never chose. I set the sketchbook on my coffee table and plugged in my sewing machine. It felt almost ceremonial. Not rebellion. Restoration. I spent the next days living in a rhythm I crafted deliberately. Morning walks. Afternoons working at the firm. Evenings learning how to breathe without asking permission. I pulled fabric swatches from drawers, ordered small bundles online, stitched simple pieces. Nothing dramatic. Enough to remind my hands they once knew how to create. When doubts surfaced, they did not roar. They whispered the way doubt always spoke in my family. "Are you sure this is wise? Is this proper? Should you be focusing on something more respectable?" I did not fight the voice. I simply did not obey it. There were moments when sadness came quietly like a tide washing over sand. Not sadness for losing support, but sadness for ever believing I needed it to validate my choices. I took one therapy session booked discreetly during lunch hour. I did not unpack everything. I did not dissect my past. I simply discussed how to hold space for my own dreams without guilt. It felt like realignment, not repair. A subtle shift the way a house breathes when windows open for the first time in spring. When invitations arrived in the mail from friends planning engagement parties or baby showers, I responded with handwritten cards. Yes, I would attend. Yes, I was happy for them. My life was not paused. It was simply rewriting itself without audience commentary. One Saturday afternoon, I sewed a simple ivory dress. Not a wedding dress. A dress for no occasion except the pleasure of making it. I hung it on my closet door and stared at it longer than I meant to. Creating something without needing approval felt like stepping into sunlight after years indoors. Michael supported my quiet transformation without trying to direct it. He would come by with iced coffee and place it on the counter, kiss my forehead, ask about my week, and then listen without trying to solve it. I did not need him to fight for me. I only needed him not to stop me from fighting for myself. We spoke about the wedding occasionally gently, as if it were a fragile object we were both learning how to hold again without letting outside hands break it. There was no rush. Healing is not dramatic when it is genuine. It is slow, steady, almost unnoticed until one day you realize you are stronger than you were before. I noticed small changes first. I no longer paused before stating preferences. I no longer adjusted my tone to sound less firm. If I wanted to spend a Saturday morning sewing instead of attending a networking brunch, I did. Without explanation. Without guilt. Each choice, tiny and quiet, stitched a little more independence back into me. One evening, as I folded soft linen napkins and placed fresh flowers in a vase, I realized something simple and profound. I felt at peace. Not triumphant. Not vengeful. Peaceful. That was the moment I knew I was no longer rebuilding from damage. I was building toward possibility. You see, sometimes survival does not look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like creating a life that is gentle, steady, and finally your own. And if you have ever rebuilt yourself silently choosing progress instead of permission, then you understand the power of quiet resilience. Comment: I kept going. If you have ever stood back up without making a sound, if you have ever decided that your life did not need an audience to be meaningful. Because that is what I learned in those months. Sometimes strength is not the voice that rises. Sometimes strength is the life that unfolds slowly and steadily in the direction you choose for yourself. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late spring, the kind of morning where the world feels deceptively calm. The sunlight fell across my kitchen counter, warming the stack of folded linens and the half-finished sketch beside my coffee mug. I had just returned from my morning walk and was preparing to start work when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I had grown comfortable in selective quiet, answering only what served my peace. But the number flashed with a Charleston area code and a familiar name beneath it: Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. My heart paused, then steadied. I took a breath and answered. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," a soft professional voice greeted me. "This is Anna from the events office. I hope you are well." I told her I was. She hesitated, the kind of hesitation that signals information someone wishes they did not have to deliver. "We received your follow-up confirmation regarding the cancellation, and I wanted to check if you needed assistance with the adjustment processing." My spine stiffened, though my voice remained even. "I am sorry, what cancellation?" A quiet beat on the other end. Then another. I felt the air change, like the room had leaned slightly. "The cancellation request for your wedding reservation," she clarified gently. "The one signed and emailed from your account." I gripped the edge of the counter. "I have not sent any cancellation." "We have a signed document," she replied, cautious now, "and an email that appeared to be from your address." I asked her to forward it to me. When it came through, seconds later, I opened the attachment. It was my name, my signature, except it wasn't. The curve of the E was wrong, the loop in the Y too tight, the tone of the email formal in a way I had never written. I felt a steady warmth rise in my chest, not panic but clarity. Someone had spoken into my voice without my permission. "May I ask," I said softly, "were any payments adjusted or redirected as a result of this cancellation?" She answered slowly, choosing words carefully. "A portion of your deposit has been reassigned per the request." I closed my eyes just briefly. "Thank you." I said, maintaining composure because composure was not surrender. Could you please send me the paperwork and the confirmation trail? Of course, she replied. I hope everything is all right. I paused before responding. Everything is becoming clear, I said. After we ended the call, I stood in the stillness of my kitchen. Outside, the world carried on in its ordinary rhythm. Inside me, a line had been crossed. This was not sentiment. This was action taken without consent, using my identity influencing my financial arrangements. I glanced toward the sketchbook open on my table. My old life and my new life sat side by side in that moment, and I realized that sometimes clarity arrives not like thunder, but like a single light flickering on in a dark hallway. By midday, I had gathered emails, bank documents, and screenshots. Quietly, methodically. Years of being raised to appear composed had become the very tool that now steadied me. I did not call my mother. I did not send a message. I refused to alert someone who moved in shadows of etiquette and subtle influence. Instead, I called someone who understood structure, evidence, and dignity. Diane Whitaker, a former corporate counsel turned independent advisor, known for her calm intelligence and precise speech. When she answered, I greeted her evenly. Diane, I need to review something with you. It appears there have been financial irregularities associated with my wedding arrangements, including actions taken using my name without authorization. She asked me to come in that afternoon. Her office was quiet and lined with dark wood shelves, degrees framed meticulously behind her desk. She gestured for me to sit, and I handed her a folder containing everything I had collected. She reviewed each page, her expression steady, thoughtful, her pen tapping once when she reached the forged signature. Identity misuse, she said finally, more to herself than to me, and deposit reallocation without verified consent. She tapped the form again. This is clearly not your handwriting. I nodded once. I know. Her gaze lifted to mine. Who had access to this information? I did not answer directly. Some doors you allow others to open themselves. Instead, I replied, there are individuals who believed they were safeguarding a legacy that mattered more than my autonomy. Her eyes narrowed slightly, reading between the lines. Family situations, she murmured. Often the most complicated. We discussed next steps, no accusations, no assumptions, documentation, verification, a formal inquiry to vendors and financial institutions, a request for record audits, a civil petition if necessary to establish boundaries and restore control. You are approaching this correctly, she said, quietly, with structure. That is how you protect yourself, your reputation, and your peace. I felt something shift inside me again. Not anger, not indignation, resolve. After we finished, I walked out of her office into the late afternoon sun. Charleston moved around me, vendors selling pralines, tourists snapping photos of horse carriages, locals sipping sweet tea on shaded porches. The world felt ordinary, and yet I felt different. When I got home, I did not pace or unravel. I lit a candle. I tidied the living room. I poured water into a glass vase and placed fresh flowers inside. Order is not always control. Sometimes it is reclaiming space. That evening, I sat at my sewing machine and stitched one line of fabric, then another. My life was not unraveling. It was revealing. If you have ever looked at a situation and realized the truth was sitting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for you to see it, then you understand this moment. Clarity does not destroy you. It strengthens you. Comment, I kept going. If you have ever faced a turning point, not with panic, but with poise. If you have ever chosen to protect your future by reclaiming your name, your voice, and your right to define your own life. Because sometimes justice begins not in loud confrontation, but in a quiet decision to document everything and stand firm in truth. 2 days after my meeting with Diane, I received a call from a number I had not seen in months. Uncle Raymond, my father's older brother, a man who lived most of his life on Hilton Head in a weathered house facing the marsh, far from the polished routines of Beaufort society. He had always been different, quieter, yes, but in an honest way. He never tried to mold conversations like my parents did. When I answered, his voice carried the same gentle gravel I remembered from childhood summers spent fishing off his dock. "Eleanor," he said, "we need to talk." It was not a request so much as a solemn nudge. I asked when. He paused. "Now, if you have time." I drove to meet him that afternoon. The sky was clear and the tide, low egrets standing in the mud flats like porcelain figures. His house always smelled faintly of cedar and salt, and the screen door still creaked the same way it had when I was 10. He made tea without asking how I liked it. He already knew. We sat on the screened porch while a slow breeze moved through the Spanish moss. He looked at me closely, the kind of look that measures not what you say, but what you carry. "I heard about the change in wedding plans," he said gently. I nodded. "There is more to discuss than a canceled celebration." I folded my hands in my lap. "I suspected that." He leaned back, exhaled. "Your grandfather set aside a trust for you when you were born. You may remember pieces of that." "I do vaguely," I said. I had always been told it was modest, meant for future planning. That was the narrative. He nodded once. "It was meant to activate fully upon your marriage contingent on a formal audit for compliance and distribution. The intention was to ensure whoever you married understood partnership, not advantage." Quietly, my chest tightened. He continued, and there was no softness in his tone now. "Funds have been accessed from it for years. Subtly. Quiet transfers. Small enough over time not to attract attention." I listened without flinching. I had learned long ago that in families like ours, betrayal rarely came with noise. It came with etiquette. I asked who authorized those withdrawals. He held my gaze. "Your parents." There was no embellishment, no apology, just truth placed in the open like a stone on the table. "They believed," he continued, "that they were protecting your sister during difficult periods and managing household equity. They always assumed you would understand eventually." Understand. The way a person understands a burglary if the intruder wears silk gloves. The way a child understands silence is love if told so enough times. I stayed silent, letting the information settle in steady lines instead of chaos. "And canceling the wedding," I said quietly, "prevented the audit." He nodded. "The audit would have revealed everything. A formal review would have triggered scrutiny. They hoped delaying your marriage would delay the truth." I felt no sharp snap of shock, no gasp or dramatic disbelief. This revelation did not crash like a wave. It arrived like a tide that had been rising quietly all along. I had always known my family valued image over honesty, legacy over individuality. I just did not realize how far they were willing to bend ethics to maintain control. Uncle Raymond looked at me with a sadness that was not pity. It was recognition. "You deserved the truth," he said, "and the choice to decide what it means." I met his eyes. "Thank you for telling me." He took a sip of his tea. "You do not have to decide now, but whatever you choose, do it with clear eyes." I rose, walked to the porch railing, and watched the water ripple under the soft wind. Betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly beneath years of polite conversation woven into the fabric of family expectations. I thought about every time I had been guided, corrected, redirected. Every praise withheld. Every dream considered unsuitable. Every decision shaped to fit a legacy that was not mine. And then I thought about Michael, about the life we were building, about Magnolia Plantation, about a signature that did not belong to me. I realized something then. It was not just that my parents misused funds. It was that they feared my independence enough to interfere with my future. I turned back to my uncle. "I appreciate your honesty," I said, "but I am not shocked." He nodded, understanding. "You have always seen more than they believed." It was not a compliment, not exactly. More like truth acknowledging truth. When I left, he walked me to my car. Before I got in, he said softly, "Eleanor, dignity is not silence. It is choosing when to speak and what to say." I nodded once. His words felt like a small bridge between who I had been raised to be and who I was becoming. On the drive home, I kept the windows down. The wind moved through my hair and salt air filled the car. The world looked the same, yet I knew I was no longer navigating it as someone seeking approval. When I reached Charleston, I sat in my parked car for a moment, watching the evening light soften across the rooftops. I sent Michael a short message. Home. See you soon. Then another message to Diane. I have new information. Let us proceed. No anger, no drama. Just decision. Calm, precise. Betrayal can break a person or carve them into someone stronger, and sometimes strength does not roar. It speaks quietly with certainty. That afternoon, sitting in my car, as the sun dipped low, I felt no desire for revenge. I felt something cleaner, resolve. Because when a family uses love as leverage and legacy as a leash, choosing yourself is not rebellion. It is reclamation. And I was done mistaking quiet control for care. It was time to step into truth, not tradition. And I would do so without raising my voice. The Beaufort County Courthouse did not look like a place for dramatic revelations. It looked like tradition carved into brick and white columns, quiet and dignified, a building where time did not rush and justice did not shout. The morning of the hearing arrived warm and windless, the kind of southern morning where the air feels tight before the day unfolds. I dressed simply, ivory blouse, soft gray suit, pearl earrings, but small ones, not the heirlooms that my mother once insisted were essential for any Hayes woman attending a formal proceeding. I chose steadiness over symbolism. Diane met me on the courthouse steps, her expression calm, her notebook in one hand, a folder tucked under the other arm. She glanced at me and gave a small nod. You are ready. It sounded less like reassurance and more like acknowledgement. Inside the courtroom was modest. Wooden pews, polished floors, the quiet shuffle of papers. Not a spectacle, not a battle, just a room where truth would be placed on record. My parents sat across the aisle. My mother in navy silk posture, perfect chin slightly raised as if posture could anchor control. My father beside her, nodding politely to acquaintances performing calm. Charlotte sat one seat behind them, glossy hair eyes darting between me and the courtroom door like she expected someone to intervene and restore hierarchy. No one came. Michael took his place behind me, close enough for presence, far enough to let me stand on my own. When the clerk called my name, I rose, Diane at my side. We are here today regarding a petition for administrative review of financial arrangements and authorization discrepancies related to a private event contract, she stated. No accusations, no hostility, just structure clarity. The judge, a man in his early 60s with a composed face and attentive eyes, nodded. We will review the documentation and testimony. Let us proceed. Diane presented the first set of records, the venue contract, the deposit confirmations, the cancellation email, the signature discrepancy. On the screen, side by side, my signed agreement and the cancellation form appeared. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Diane did not dramatize. She simply pointed to details. The loop height, the angle of the final stroke, the spacing between letters. Then she called the handwriting specialist. A woman with calm eyes and steady voice testified with precision. The signature on the cancellation form varies from the verified exemplar in consistent ways, suggesting it was not executed by the same individual. My mother shifted in her seat, the smallest tilt of her chin. My father looked at the table, not at the screen. Next came the email trail. Diane had subpoenaed the venue system logs and attached IP metadata. The cancellation request did not originate from my device, not from my home, not from my office. It originated from the Hayes family network in Beaufort. The courtroom remained still, but energy shifted. Truth does not need volume to command a room. Then came the trust documentation. Uncle Raymond stepped forward, hat in hand, out of habit, even though he was inside. He gave factual testimony. The trust was designed to activate upon marriage. A formal audit was required at activation. Disbursements over several years were made prior to activation, just under reporting thresholds consistent and deliberate in pattern. Quietly spoken, but clear. The judge listened without interruption. My mother's attorney asked questions that sounded polite but carried implication. Administrative oversight, family access assumptions, standard familial financial management. But those explanations thinned under evidence. The handwriting, the IP record, the withdrawals, the cancellation timeline aligning precisely with the expected audit trigger. And finally, Diane asked me to speak. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I explained calmly. I trusted that my wedding was being supported in good faith. I believed family guidance was offered out of care. I did not anticipate decisions being made in my name without my consent. I did not expect personal assets tied to my future to be used without transparency. My mother watched me, expression carefully still. My father blinked slowly, his jaw tight. Charlotte looked at me as if I had broken a silent pact, the unspoken rule that family fractures must remain hidden under polished surfaces. But this room was not a parlor. It was record. And truth placed gently is still truth. When I finished, the judge leaned back. The silence stretched just long enough to feel like breath held in unison. Then he spoke. This case is not criminal in nature, and it will not be treated as such. We are here to determine rightful authorization and transparency in financial matters. He glanced at my parents. It is the finding of this court that the petitioner did not authorize the cancellation nor the transfers associated. Funds are to be returned to the trust immediately. A verification audit is to be initiated. Administrative penalties apply. Additionally, ethical reprimand will be documented due to misuse of authority within fiduciary oversight. No dramatic slam of the gavel, no raised voice, just verdict, clean, steady, final. My mother inhaled sharply so quietly only those nearest noticed. My father sat motionless the way one sits when a foundation shifts beneath the surface. Charlotte's face paled, panic flickering before being masked by composure learned young. And me, I did not feel triumph. I felt alignment, a world righted quietly after being tilted for too long. When we exited the courtroom, the hallway smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Reporters were not there. Cameras were not there. Justice is often quiet, particularly in communities that value dignity over spectacle. Outside, the light was soft. Diane turned to me. "Well done," she said. But it was not praise. It was recognition. I nodded. This was never about victory. It was about truth. My parents walked out moments later. My mother lifted her chin, managing grace even in defeat. "Eleanor," she whispered as she passed, "we were guiding you." I held her gaze. Guidance does not require secrecy. Control does. She blinked once, not in shock, but acknowledgement the kind given when a game ends and both players understand who laid down the final piece. My father murmured something that sounded like regret, trying to find shape. Charlotte avoided my eyes entirely. Michael took my hand. Proud does not describe what was in his expression. It was deeper. A quiet knowing. A recognition of the endurance it takes to free oneself from legacy that binds more tightly than chains. We walked down the courthouse steps into sunlight, and I realized something simple. Freedom rarely announces itself with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives in a stamped document, in a quiet breath you did not realize you had been holding for years. If you have ever stood in a room where truth finally outweighed tradition, you know this feeling. It is not fury. It is clarity, not noise, strength. Comment "I kept going" if you have ever defended your name without shouting, if you have ever chosen truth over approval, even when silence would have been easier. Because sometimes dignity is not inherited, sometimes it is earned. The first ripple did not come from me. It came from the local paper. A discreet headline buried on page 4 beneath council updates and fishing season notices. Trust review ordered for prominent Beaufort family. No names, no drama, just enough information for anyone familiar with the pattern of Southern social reporting to read between the lines. In communities like ours, the absence of detail is its own kind of revelation. For generations, reputation had been our currency, our armor, our quiet declaration of status. And now, without a single explosive scandal or arrest, without voices raised or accusations hurled publicly, the thread began to unravel. At church, the hymns sounded the same, but the air shifted. The ushers still held the doors open with practiced courtesy, but their polite smiles lingered a second longer as my parents walked past. Not warmth. Study. Analysis. Concern masked as cordiality. The pew where my family always sat remained filled my mother sitting straight as ever, head-high pearls gleaming against her collar. Yet whispers moved like soft wind through magnolia leaves. Not loud enough to accuse, not bold enough to confront, but present enough to remind everyone that prestige once questioned becomes fragile. After service, friends approached with overly bright smiles and lightly trembling voices. If there is anything we can do, we hope you are all managing. Prayers for clarity. Words wrapped in sympathy but weighted with curiosity. In the South, trouble is not confirmed by confession. It is confirmed by the gentle tone people use when pretending they do not know anything at all. At the charity board where my mother had long held influence, invitations stopped arriving with the same punctual grace. Committees she once led were reorganized, meetings shifted to times she had not been informed of. Not exclusion. Not yet. Just distance. The kind applied delicately the way you handle fine china you are no longer sure is stable. Behind manicured hedges and before audiences sipping sweet tea on verandas, explanations were offered with practiced humility. A misunderstanding, a procedural issue, just a little review, nothing worth concern. But concern had already taken root. Prestige once rattled does not settle easily. And then there was Charlotte. Her boutique had always been a social darling project celebrated at luncheons featured in lifestyle articles that praised her taste and entrepreneurial spirit. The lease renewal notice arrived quietly one Friday morning. The landlord, a longtime acquaintance of my parents, expressed regret, but cited business restructuring. A new tenant had already been identified. The boutique would need to vacate within 60 days. Charlotte called me that evening, not with apology, not with reflection, with disbelief. "Can you believe this, Eleanor? They are making a mistake. They know who our family is." Her voice trembled with indignation, not awareness. The world she had always been cushioned by was thinning, and she did not yet understand why. She did not ask how I was. She did not acknowledge what had preceded this shift. She simply raged softly at the unfairness of losing something she believed was guaranteed. Entitlement has a narrow field of vision. In Beaufort, Circus, people did not confront my family. They simply adjusted their distance. The invitation lists, once guaranteed, grew shorter. Social conversations drifted past them instead of around them. The subtle nods of respect became polite nods of recognition. Not disgrace, just cooling. The kind of cooling that happens when influence stops radiating warmth. I did not celebrate, but I did observe. Watching a power built on appearance falter quietly is not gratifying. It is revealing. Meanwhile, in Charleston, my life did not shrink. It steadied. I continued my morning walks, my sewing, my work. Friends asked gentle questions, and I answered only those that supported peace. I did not defend myself. I did not explain. I simply existed outside a hierarchy I had once believed unavoidable. One evening, sitting at my small dining table with fabric spread around me, I opened my laptop and drafted a single sentence. Not angry, not triumphant, not vengeful, just truth in its simplest form. Silence is preparation. I posted it without hashtags, without elaboration. It was not aimed at anyone. It was simply the truth of what stillness had taught me. Within hours, messages arrived. Quiet encouragement, understanding. A few from women who had been raised in similar households where love was conditional and obedience framed as honor. They knew the language behind the line. They recognized the strength in absence. In Beaufort, whispers about that post began to travel the same way secrets always had. Carefully, softly. Women pouring tea leaned closer. Men adjusting cufflinks exchanged glances. Why would she say something like that? Did something happen? Does this have to do with the hearing? It is fascinating how a sentence can unsettle a world built on unspoken rules. But here is the truth I learned in those months. Collapse is not always loud. Sometimes it begins with the soft hum of withheld invitations. Sometimes it looks like a boutique closing quietly. Sometimes it is a polite pause in a church greeting line. And sometimes it is a single sentence from a woman who once stayed silent to survive, now speaking without shouting. At home, I lit a candle and continued sewing thread moving through silk like a whisper shaping into form. I did not need to witness every reaction. I did not need validation. I was not seeking to punish anyone. I was reclaiming space. My mother still held her head high at functions offering soft explanations and carefully practiced smiles. My father withdrew into silence deeper than before, avoiding questions no one asked but everyone wondered about. Charlotte tried to salvage her boutique's image with curated posts and promotional brunches, but enthusiasm does not erase uncertainty. And me, I did not need their decline to rise. I only needed distance to breathe. If you have ever stepped back from a world that demanded your conformity and watched it continue without you wobbling slightly because your compliance was part of its balance, then you know this feeling. Strength is often mistaken for silence, but silence, when chosen, becomes power. Comment I kept going. If you have ever watched something built on appearances tremble when faced with truth and realized you no longer needed that structure to hold you, because sometimes the collapse of an illusion is not tragedy. It is clarity arriving right on time. The morning of our wedding arrived without fanfare. No phones buzzing, no schedules dictated by planners, no anxious undercurrent of performance. Just soft coastal light slipping through sheer curtains and the sound of waves folding themselves onto the sand at Hilton Head Island. For the first time, a wedding day felt exactly like what it should be. Not a display, not a strategic alignment of legacy and social choreography, but a beginning. The sky was pale gold when I stepped outside the breeze, carrying the faint scent of salt and early sunlight glistening across the water. Our ceremony site sat on a quiet stretch of beach untouched by tourists at that hour. Driftwood lay artfully where the tide had left it. Sea oats swayed in gentle rhythm, and a simple arch of white fabric rippled like breath against the breeze. No towering florals, no seating charts, no place cards curated by social ranking. What we had instead was presence. Real presence. A small circle of people who had walked beside us, not because they gained something by standing there, but because they were choosing us in the same way we chose them. Friends arrived barefoot, some carrying small bouquets picked from backyard gardens, others holding warm coffee cups, faces glowing with sincerity instead of performance. Michael waited near the archway, hands clasped, expression soft with anticipation. Not nervous, not overwhelmed, just present, grounded, hopeful. I stood a little distance away with the ocean behind me, holding the dress I made. It was not elaborate. It did not shimmer. It did not need to. Ivory silk, clean lines, a subtle drape across the shoulders, a fitted bodice, a skirt that moved like quiet intention every time I breathed. Sewing it had not been about rebellion. It had been about reclaiming the part of myself I once tucked away to fit inside someone else's world. I stepped into it slowly, feeling every thread as if it held pieces of the girl I used to be, the one who drew dresses in the margins of math homework, the one who whispered dreams quietly so they would not be dismissed. And now, here she was, wearing her own creation, on her own terms, with no eyes watching for approval except her own. I did not have bridesmaids flanking me on each side or a parent offering an arm. I walked alone. On sand, warmed by rising sun, with wind lifting my veil just enough to feel like the world was opening rather than closing. Each step felt like shedding a story I never chose. The story of being curated instead of understood, of being shaped instead of celebrated, of being guided so carefully that I forgot I could guide myself. When I reached Michael, his eyes glossed with quiet emotion. "You look like yourself," he whispered. "Not beautiful, not stunning. Like yourself." It was the highest compliment I had ever received. The officiant, a friend not a figurehead, began the ceremony. No speeches about legacy or heritage. No references to lineage or community standing. Just words about partnership, kindness, resilience, and choice. The vow I spoke was not written to impress a crowd. It was written for us. I promised to choose honesty over expectation, to build a life where we were partners, not performers, to honor joy even when the world demanded perfection. Michael promised presence. Not protection, I did not need rescuing, but unwavering presence. A witness and companion rather than a shield. As we exchanged rings, a gentle gust swept across the shore, scattering tiny shells like confetti nature provided without needing permission. When we kissed, someone laughed softly, not in mockery, but in pure affection for a moment unforced. There was no applause, just warmth. Afterward, we shared breakfast under a simple canopy, fresh fruit, warm pastries, coffee. No towering cake tiers designed to impress. Just sweetness you could taste rather than admire. People talked, softly, laughed, freely, removed shoes, let sand cling to their ankles without worrying about photographs. My Uncle Raymond lifted a small glass and offered the briefest toast. To courage, quiet enough to grow roots, and to love brave enough to stay gentle. It was the only speech, and it was perfect. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Michael and I walked along the shoreline alone. My dress hem gathered salt water, my hair tangled in sea breeze, and I felt more polished in those imperfect details than I ever had in a ballroom. Not because this day was flawless, but because it was true. There was no performance, no debt owed to legacy, no approval sought or withheld. Just us. Building a life not on expectation but on understanding. I looked out at the horizon and realized I felt no grief for what had been lost, only gratitude for what had been reclaimed, my identity, my voice, my peace. The approval I once chased had been replaced by self-trust so steady it did not need applause to feel real. And I knew then with quiet certainty that I did not walk down the beach alone that morning because I had been abandoned. I walked alone because I chose to. Independence is not the absence of people, it is the presence of self. If you have ever stood at the edge of something new and realized you were finally stepping into your own life rather than someone else's plan, then you know this feeling. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is calm, full, free. And that morning, with the ocean breathing beside me and sunlight warming my skin, I understood something profound. They thought walking without them would break me, but it was the first time I truly arrived. It did not happen immediately. Pride has a long burn time, especially in families trained to survive through appearance. But weeks after the wedding and the quiet unraveling of their social certainty, the calls began. First, a voicemail from my mother, her voice thinner than I had ever heard it. "Eleanor, we would like to speak with you. Things have been challenging. Your father and I are making some transitions." She did not say the words starting over, but I heard them anyway, tucked beneath practiced grace. 2 days later, my father called. He spoke in a low tone, as if still trying to sound like the man who once believed his silence carried power. "We have hit a difficult patch. Some board positions have shifted. We may need to adjust." He paused, waiting for rescue I did not offer. "Your mother could use your support, Eleanor. Family stands together." Once that sentence would have wrapped around my ribs like duty. It now sounded like habit trying to masquerade as love. I did not call back. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Silence, once their tool, now my boundary. Then Charlotte called. No hesitation, no gentleness. Just panic wrapped in indignation. "They are being ridiculous!" she nearly hissed into my voicemail. "People are acting like we have done something shameful. My lease fell through. I need a new investor and your husband has nonprofit connections." She paused, then added in a tone meant to motivate guilt. "You owe it to the family to help us rebuild." Oh, a familiar word heavy with expectation. But I did not feel guilt. I felt distance. The kind, earned, not gifted. That evening I sent one single text to the family group thread. "We can meet for coffee tomorrow morning at 10. Neutral ground, public space, not home, not past." The next morning I arrived early, not to prepare for confrontation, but to anchor myself in quiet truth. They walked in together, a united front, more out of habit than solidarity. My mother wore a conservative dress, pearls smaller than usual. My father looked tired in a way that went beyond sleeplessness. Charlotte appeared irritated, not humbled. They sat. They waited for me to speak first. But that era was over. My mother folded her napkin with careful hands. "Eleanor, we understand there have been misunderstandings. Your wedding was lovely, and we are glad you are happy." There was a pause, then a soft pivot. "We would appreciate some support as we regroup. Your father is exploring opportunities." Charlotte interrupted. "And my boutique can recover quickly with the right push. You have contacts now. You could connect me." Opportunity wrapped in entitlement. Expectation dressed as fairness. I stirred my tea slowly. For years, I thought control was love and obedience was loyalty. I believed silence kept peace. I looked at each of them not with anger, but with truth. I do not carry resentment. I do not wish you harm, but I will not re-enter a dynamic that asks me to shrink so you may stand tall. My mother blinked hard, as if emotion tried to escape, but pride held the door closed. "We only guided you," she whispered. I held her gaze. Guidance does not erase consent. Family does not mean ownership. My father inhaled slowly. "Then, you truly intend to separate yourself from us." "Separate is not rejection," I said. "It is boundary." He lowered his eyes. Charlotte leaned forward, incredulous. "You would let us fail rather than help." I shook my head gently. "I am not letting you fail. I am letting you stand." And then, softly, the only sentence that still needed saying, "I choose peace, not permission." Silence hung between us, thick and fragile. Not hostile, honest. My mother swallowed her posture, still perfect, but her certainty fractured. My father nodded once, a gesture, less like agreement and more like acceptance. Charlotte stood abruptly, wounded, pride replacing confusion. "You will regret this." But the threat felt hollow power fading into echo. I rose. I did not offer hugs or promises, just presence and then departure. The door closed behind me without weight or ceremony. It did not slam. It clicked softly, final and calm. In my chest, no sting, only breath. Because letting go is not abandonment. It is choosing a life where love is not a leash, where peace is not negotiated, where identity is not borrowed. And sometimes the most generous thing you can do for people who shaped you is allow them to meet the version of you who no longer requires their permission to exist. Peace did not arrive in a grand moment. It settled gradually like morning light, easing across a room rather than bursting through. Months passed and life unfolded without spectacle. My sewing table sat by the window, now bolts of fabric stacked neatly beside sketches pinned with small brass clips. I woke each day with clarity, not urgency, walked along the harbor at sunrise, fingers trailing the early breeze like it was blessing me quietly. The bridal studio I opened downtown did not announce itself with ribbon cuttings or press features. It grew the way good things often do, through sincerity. Brides came not because they had heard my last name whispered in the right circles, but because they wanted dresses made with intention, not expectation. They told me their stories, where they fell in love, when they realized they deserved to be seen, what parts of themselves they refused to dim for anyone. I listened, stitched, smiled. I watched women step into gowns that reflected who they were instead of who someone else told them to be. And every time a bride looked in the mirror and recognized herself fully, I felt a quiet triumph deeper than applause. Michael and I built routines that felt like home coffee on the porch, weekend trips to the farmer's market evenings, cooking barefoot with music playing low. No choreography, no audience. Just life, plain and full and earned. Sometimes I passed places that reminded me of my old world, the grand club, the church steeple homes, where image stood taller than joy. I felt no bitterness, just distance and understanding. They had their structure. I had my breath. Sometimes peace is not pride, it is presence. And if anyone ever asks when I finally became myself, I would not say the day I left, or the day the courtroom settled truth, or even the day I walked alone toward the ocean to marry the man I chose. I would say it was the day I stopped trying to make my life fit inside walls that were never built for me. Freedom does not always roar. Sometimes it simply exhales. If you have ever stepped away from expectations that silenced you, if you have ever chosen your own voice over someone else's comfort, then you already know peace is not given. It is claimed, not through rebellion, but through truth. Tell me in the comments, have you ever chosen yourself even when others did not understand? Why did it hurt, and what did it give you in the end? Comment "I chose peace" if you are walking your own path now or beginning to. And if someone out there is questioning whether they are allowed to choose happiness without permission, your story might be the light they need. I will be reading every reply.